Welcome to Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy, the podcast where insights and innovation meet. Every episode, we dive into conversations with industry leaders, experts, and change makers, bringing you the stories and ideas in the renewable energy sector that shape our world. And now, let's jump into today's episode with your host, Wes Ashworth. Welcome back to Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy. Today's guest is someone who's helped shape the solar industry from the ground up and is still pushing it forward in bold new ways. Lee Keshishian is the founder and CEO of Civic Renewables, a company focused on accelerating solar adoption by empowering high-performing local providers across the country. From co-founding Clean Currents to scaling national operations at SolarCity and Tesla to helping grow Palmetto into a top 10 solar installer, Lee has spent the last 2 decades building, scaling, and evolving what solar looks like in America. Now with Civic Renewables, he's on a mission to bridge the gap between national support and local delivery, offering design, engineering, permitting, procurement, installation, O&M, and more, all under a collaborative, decentralized model. We're going to dive into his journey, the lessons learned from building across multiple eras of solar, and his unique vision for where the industry is headed. Lee, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Wes. Excited to be here.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. Definitely excited for the conversation. So starting out, you've been in solar since really the early days. I guess what first drew you into the space and what's kept you there through all the industry changes and evolution?
I guess I started my career officially in 2007. I had been in home building the previous almost decade and was really at the front end of a large home builder, Pulte Group, and how they were looking at building communities of the future, particularly on the East Coast. Based in the Washington, D.C. area, we did projects from New England down to Richmond, and many of them were in these kind of multi-step projects. So there'd be retail, there'd be obviously residential, there may be some industrial or office space. And I was really thinking about how all the pieces come together. And so in that regard, we started looking at LEED and Energy Star, different sorts of ways of building a more efficient, footprint. And through that process, through LEED really was introduced both to my co-founders as well as kind of to the idea of really building high performance buildings and energy efficient buildings, and renewable energy being really a big part of the scorecard, literally, that is part of LEED.
Yeah.
From some of our early conversations, both internal and external, we were doing some moonlighting with some apartment developers as kind of a side business. The folks that we presented to were seeing the return of investment of solar and saying, oh, this makes total sense. Great. When can you start? And so from going from a concept really in the first months or two to saying, oh, we can totally do this.
Yeah.
We launched initially as like a consulting and energy services business, brokering electric power in the recently deregulated markets up and down the East Coast, primarily PJM utility area, to starting some of the earliest SREC trading platform. We actually started like a small division, got an agreement with Exelon's Pepco group, and eventually sold that off to Sol Systems, which is one of the larger players now in the SREC business. We got the first contract. I think we did 40 RECs in the first year. It was nothing. And decided we're not going to focus on this. But those early stages of trying to figure out how the pieces fit together, which really came down to, how do you tell somebody about the economics of solar? How do you get them to understand the long-term value that it provides? And not just be focused on selling a bunch of, panels and some equipment and hoping. It wasn't just around doing something that was maybe good from an environmental standpoint, but it was something that was good from an economic one. And I think that was the thing that got us started. I think got me on the journey, getting excited to ultimately leave the home builder that I was at to do it full time. And then obviously try and accelerate it through our own work and then working with SolarCity, where really we were able to actually start doing it in scale as opposed to trying to play it one step at a time.
Right, absolutely. And kind of thinking that from Clean Currents to SolarCity to Tesla to where you are now, how did each chapter shape your view of what the industry needed the most? And tell us a little bit about that.
Boy, I think it's it's probably something that could be mapped out in a business case standpoint
Yeah.
that you'd see in any business school, and where we are in the life cycle of solar. The early days, there were the original pioneers who really were just trying to figure out how to get the products built, to
Yeah.
find the equipment, to understand what was possible. I was not in that first round. I got to, sit at the table with some of them who had already been doing it for a decade, and
Right.
really, frankly, humbled by their focus and dedication in those early stages. But really, in the conversations like I just started, is trying to have the understanding of what are the economics. Why would the average consumer want to do this? That was like the first step. And once you could play out the return on investment, building out a spreadsheet like I had to when I was in the home building to say, what's the ROI on deciding what we're going to do from a construction standpoint for this publicly traded company? Now, that wasn't something that I saw from any of my peer group in the market, with the exception of Jigar Shah, who had started Sun Edison around the same time and here in the DC area, and seeing what he was able to do with a power purchase agreement. That
Yeah.
to me was the big aha moment that changed everything for us, and being able to say, putting these pieces together make the economics work. The next thing I'd say was, once that was in place, was, well, who's going to do all this work? And
Right.
so I think
Yeah.
the next challenge was, well, the solar industry, as I saw it, particularly again here on the East Coast, saw it from a distance on the West Coast, was made up of a bunch of long-lasting companies who had been very local, who understood maybe their local marketplace, were not looking to do large volume, or if they were, it was maybe not as maybe well thought of for the long term. And here comes along a company like SolarCity that's saying, hey, we can go and do this in scale.
Yeah.
And the challenge, though, was who's going to do the work. So as they said, we're going to start selling systems and ultimately being acquired and starting to do it on the East Coast, there weren't enough installers out there. So the next kind of level was just getting people adopted into this industry and finding them from far and afield.
Yeah.
They were, typical construction backgrounds, but there were
Mhm.
also, people coming the door who were Ivy Leaguers,
You're right.
and asking the question, what are you doing here? And they're like, hey, I just want to make a difference. And I
Yeah.
don't feel like I can do it, working in a bank or working, in an office of some sort. And by the way, I love to hike. I love to rock climb. I love
Yeah.
to,
Yeah.
whatever, do snowboarding, whatever. They liked being outdoors.
Sure.
And they had a belief system, and they had, frankly, an ability to learn, that they became really the basis of how this next generation was built upon. So we started bringing now more of an academic approach to operations, logistics, sales, to try and build really a company that could ultimately go public. A lot of lessons learned, I'd say, in those early stages. We were really focused on, building a good mousetrap, so to speak, making sure the product was installed correctly, that we were making the economics work for the homeowner as best as the systems would allow. Obviously thinking that there was this ability to grow something special on a national level. But as we started going from these regional kind of locales to really truly becoming this national company and putting the infrastructure in place, it became more and more difficult to
Yeah.
set common standards, because one, how the labor force was in one market was different than another,
Yeah.
but also the rules, the AHJs, the permitting authorities, the utility requirements, they differed so dramatically depending upon where you were, that you couldn't bring one kind of size fits all to the sale, the design, the installation. And where we were able to continue our scale was having that recognition of allowing that local knowledge to persist, really to foster it, so that
Yeah.
we could work within a national platform. But we understood that we had to still be tied and let the local people have a lot of decision making in the process. To do that, the thought was, well, we need to set up though efficiencies, and we're going to set up, a national kind of back office.
Mhm.
So SolarCity did that. I think going today, between what's happened with COVID, technology improvements, a lot of that doesn't have to be literally under one roof.
Yeah.
I think that the ability to decentralize the entire workflow and employee base can remain. And I think as I kind of go into this next chapter in my life, I think that's kind of what I'm trying to tap into. But yeah, I mean, the roller coaster, it seems like in some ways, because of technology and because of where we are, we're somewhat going full circle, but just with a whole lot of knowledge
Right.
to a place where we can go back to having local companies that operate efficiently and do good work for the consumer without having to be a large vertical integrated national company,
Yeah.
which is what we had to in the middle stages.
Right. Absolutely. And as you've outlined, so your path ultimately led you to launch Civic Renewables, where you are today, which is a fresh take on an old challenge. How to scale solar while staying close to the communities being served. So let's get into what makes Civic's model different, and take me back to kind of like the birth of Civic Renewables. What was the problem you were trying to solve when you launched it? And what's the model that sets you apart?
Yeah, so I'd say the birth of it actually, in some regards, happened at Palmetto
Yeah.
as the other side of a problem solution. Palmetto, the idea was, okay, this next chapter after SolarCity is you can have a breaking of the service plans, if you will. So you can have local operations, you can have back office in a centralized way, you could have financing through third party, you could have design through third party. I mean, what happened at the end of SolarCity were things like Aurora and other sorts of design software to really take hold. Third-party financing companies,
Yeah.
Mosaic probably being the first, Good Leap, others. And so all of a sudden, what you had to be vertically integrated as a Sunrun or SolarCity or Vivint, you now could break apart and basically tap into the same kind of caliber of resources that the verticals had. And so in that thought process, at Palmetto, we thought, okay, we could have some sales enablement tools that
Mm-hmm.
sales organizations could operate off of. That was the Alchemy platform. We would, at that time, partner with the best in class finance products. Now, obviously, Palmetto has their own internal product. And that we could set scopes of work and partner with local solar companies to actually do the installation. I think the reality of that as that continue to grow is not all groups are equal
Right.
in terms of the kind of the financial, I'd say even on a business standpoint, the financial acumen to understand how they're doing operationally speaking, the ability to hire, train, and just kind of the general kind of administrative side of running construction
Mm-hmm.
varied by market, by company within market.
Yeah.
And so, there were companies that I saw that did certain things really well
Mm-hmm.
and ones that didn't. And so as, I got back into solar after taking a couple year hiatus, I thought, okay, here's the flip side of what Palmetto we were trying to do back then, which is
Yeah.
there are well-run local solar companies that can
Yeah.
do good work. They may sell their own systems, but the reality of the marketplace with EPC and other sorts of constructs are, there's no reason why they can't grow their own footprint, or their ability within their own backyard by partnering with other organizations, which is what we were doing. But would a platform group want to work with, 100 companies, or would they
Mm-hmm.
rather work with a handful of companies that are in multiple markets? And the attitude that I had is, okay, well, there's this debate, and if it could be, a number of companies, but they're all under one umbrella. Now that platform is dealing with, purchasing and invoicing,
Yeah.
accounting, insurance, all these things under one relationship, but they have the power of that company that's well known in that local marketplace, that has relationships with the AHJs, with the utility, with the various inspectors, of being a company that's known for doing high quality work. So they get kind of the best of both worlds, where they're able to tap into a number of partners, but having this kind of one-stop shop approach to the engagement. And that could be across, an EPC relationship, that could be with just a subcontractor,
Right.
where they're doing everything, but they've decided they're selling in their own systems in, New Jersey and New York, and they would like to sell in Ohio, but they don't want to go and develop a platform in Ohio because they
Sure.
know how hard it is, and they'd rather find a good partner to work with. And if they can, and it's with us, then obviously it makes it easier for them to go and expand their sales footprint or their back office footprint. But the hardest thing is going to be the person who's actually doing the install, and they'd rather have somebody who's doing that of high quality.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how the initial ideas of this came to be, which is, can we put together a handful of well-run companies that know their marketplace, and by doing so, relationships that they have in their markets could only improve because they've got the backing of a company like Civic with our
Yeah.
resources. They can do a better job of how they market, invoice, any number of the basic elements, and people feel more confident because there's a larger parent that's supporting it financially, but knowing that they pick up the phone and they can still talk to a person who's in that local office that lives and breathes, the customer experience at that local level. They know that, the traffic on this freeway is bad
Yeah.
because they live in that community, as opposed to, being 1,000 miles away in a call center. And then the other side of it is these relationships have a synergistic thing. So
Yeah.
Florida Power Management, for example, had great relationships with a handful of financiers who were essentially doing cleanup work for out of business solar companies.
Okay.
So not going into the specifics, but there's a couple
Right.
of large, financial services companies that had well-known bankruptcies happen.
Hmm.
They asked Florida Power Management to help these customers, because of the reputation they have, to go in and in many cases just rebuild the systems because of how poorly they were installed in the first place. Well, upon the acquisition, that spawned work in 2 other states,
Yeah.
because they're like, oh, great, you guys do such great work. We like working with you. Great, you can do work in these other markets where we have the same issues,
Yep.
and that's now yielded more work. Similarly with, subcontracting work, where large regional companies are working in, multiple states, where we're working with them in one state. Now they're saying maybe you can work with us in 2 or 3 other states. And sales organizations, where there are people who are like, boy, I love selling in Ohio, just not in February. I'd love to sell in Florida, and
Yeah.
so on and so forth. So, we're getting some obvious benefits of like a more of a national company, but when we're dealing with the consumer, their relationship is with Green Rack of Pittsburgh in Ohio, of Ipsen of Northern Virginia, Maryland, DC, of Florida Power Management of Orlando. And they're talking to people who are on the ground in those markets, who really are critical to the success of those companies as being part of the community, as
Yeah.
opposed to talking to a company based in California or New York or whatever that happens to have a division or a solid office in that market. So it just means we're a little bit more invested in the long term of being in that marketplace.
Yeah, I love it. And I think it makes so much sense, as you've outlined it and you covered it pretty well there. Just the kind of like what's in it for each party, what are the benefits, why it makes sense. And it's such a cool solution. I know through that and some of the other things you emphasize that solar isn't just about panels or hardware. It's a service business at its core. Let's unpack that a little bit, how that mindset changes, how we build and operate companies in this space. And just firstly, so why do you believe solar should be treated as a service industry? And what changes when we take that view seriously?
Well, I go back to the very beginning. Coming out of more of a, construction, home building mindset, I looked
Right.
at the vendors that we had, the HVAC companies, the plumbers, what have you. They're very important businesses, but they're not sexy businesses. We're not
Yeah.
selling, we're not trying to sell the future in a way that, I got to do with maybe at least one of the companies has definitely built their reputation on, sending a person to Mars.
Right.
This is about like basic home services and taking the next step. I kind of always said this when I was in home building, but who was the person or what happened that made us all want to have, stainless steel appliances? I
Yeah.
remember as a kid, like, I don't know, it was like a white stove.
Yep.
And
Yeah.
somebody said, no, I've got to have stainless steel. It's the exact same oven or stove or whatever, just with a different format, or
Yeah.
saying you have to have granite countertops.
Mhm.
There was these evolutions that occurred, and I saw that in home building. And, in some regards, I'm like, look, there's the next thing.
Yeah.
But it's just like, so you're going to partner with, a HVAC company who's going to get you the better rated HVAC system. And certainly there's that product aspect. But when it comes time to actually buy, you're tending to pick the one that your friends use, that
Yeah.
you see their truck in your neighborhood. They've got a great reputation. They maybe sponsor, the little league team that your kid is there or playing soccer or whatever. They're part of the community. And
Right.
it's not like they're touting, their space age technology. I mean, yeah, they are selling maybe something that is the latest and greatest, but in the end, it's about the service.
Yeah.
And invariably in those businesses, it's about the longevity. So you almost care more about the service contract than you do the equipment
Mhm.
because you want to make sure that's working. Now, there are moving parts. There are a number of things that happen with water, with hot water heaters and heat pumps and all that have more of a service maintenance aspect to it.
Sure.
But I think like the biggest disservice we've done to ourselves in solar is saying that it's maintenance free. There
Yeah.
are no moving parts. It does last for 25 years or more on a panel, and inverters lasting, 10, 15 years. The equipment has a lot of positives to its longevity, and the economics prove itself out. But to me, the biggest challenge has gone from the third-party ownership ramp up that I saw at SolarCity,
Mm-hmm.
Sunrun, to the loan offering business, which I think is what's caused a lot of the problems that we're in, is that people didn't really sell or explain probably as well what was going on in the service side. When you buy a TPO product, and even, companies, you have a SunPower TPO, they're
Yeah.
no longer in business, but there are requirements in that agreement that somebody is managing. Whoever has bought that system
Right.
has money built into the economics. Your monthly bill, you're paying $100 a month. There's probably $10, $20 a month across, 100,000 systems that are going into a pool to service those systems. So
Yeah.
there's a aspect that was always there around maintenance, and
Uh-huh.
that got lost.
Yeah.
So as we go into this next chapter, I think like there's got to be more of a clear understanding about that this is a services business. It's a
Mhm.
construction services business.
Yeah.
And so you need to have people who are well trained, know how to do the work the right time, the first time, the right time, but then understanding that things can go wrong.
Yeah.
And there is the manufacturer warranty, and then there's workmanship warranty. They're not the same thing.
Mhm.
So if we installed it correctly and something goes wrong, that's a warranty on the manufacturer, not on the service provider. So you buy an HVAC system, and in year 3, something goes wrong, and they're like, oh yeah, your condenser shot. That'll
Mhm.
be $2,000.
Yeah.
You pay $2,000. Like we don't have this whole thing. Wait a minute. You promised me this, and this for the next 20 years. Yeah, there's a warranty for whatever, 10 years on your HVAC system, but stuff goes wrong. And if it's in warranty, it's a manufacturing issue. I will install that, but somebody has to pay me for my time,
Right.
whether it's the manufacturer or it's you, the homeowner. So I
Yeah.
think there's more delineation of like what is covered, what is in there, which is going to line up more and more to the sales experience and the consumer expectations that you see in the services business. And as we enter, there's systems that I sold in how many years ago is this? 15 years ago,
Yeah.
that are coming up on the date when the inverter is going bad. There's probably other equipment that's been out in the elements that's failing.
Yeah.
It's a 150 watt panel, that can be replaced by something that's 3x.
Right.
Its performance, that there's going to be these opportunities to go and retrofit, replace, what have you, a system. And as we think about where we are and all the accolades, I guess we give ourselves about how much solar we've brought on market,
Yeah.
that is assuming that everything that was installed before is still operational.
Yeah. That's a good point.
And so we're hitting these milestones from systems that were installed at the height of 2015. I think in my region we did 450 megawatts
Yeah.
of solar on the East Coast for SolarCity. Well, that was 10 years ago.
Sure.
And so those systems are failing. Some of them
Yeah.
are needing to be replaced. And so we will have these stair steps that we'll need somebody to be in the middle of. And so that services aspect, it has to be part of our thought process and equation. And I think the people who are going to end up getting a bunch of this work are going to be the same thing. The folks who are in your community who have a good reputation. You may be living in a home that has a solar array that was installed installed by somebody else. A previous owner, you may not know who the company is that did the install, or the sticker. You call that 1-800 number and that company's out of business.
Yeah.
You're going to need somebody to step in and do the work. And that's where it's going to be a local company that has the reputation that you're going to tap into. Or, some bank now owns this system, like in the case of SunPower, and they're bankers.
Right.
So they're going to need to have partners that they work with, whether it be on an attempted national scale or regional scale. They're going to want to have a few people that they tap into. And so with all that being said, that's, I think, something that we're trying to tap into here with Civic, which is find those local companies that do good work in their market, but figure out how we can bring some national scale to, economies of scale, as well as relationships that we can get across multiple markets.
Absolutely. And as someone who's helped shape the past and present of solar and taken companies through growth and seen a lot in that time, I'm curious to hear what you see as coming next. I'd love to talk about what excites you most about where the industry is headed and the key shifts on the horizon. So thinking about that and just a space you're focused in, what excites you the most about where the residential solar space is heading currently?
So I'm going to, I guess, not hit on the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is where are we with the IRA, ITC, tariffs? As we're on this conversation this morning, there was a 180-degree flip, which I was spending most of the morning trying to figure out what this actually means.
Same.
So let's just assume somewhat normal sailing for the foreseeable future. I mean, we still have a lot of opportunity to install solar in many places where the penetration is very light.
Yeah.
And certainly there's areas of California and whatnot where they've got different sorts of things that they're contending with. And I do believe that the evolution of battery storage, to the market is going to become that much more important, in some case more important than solar, because it really is the regulating aspect of a kind of grid continuity that it provides. But there's a lot of opportunity to think about solar in general sense. I mean, we have so much new demand coming on us, not just, at our homes. I mean, we have more devices. We're seeing more movement towards heat pumps away from other sources, places like in the Northeast where they're on heating oil, things of that nature. But I'm in Northern Virginia right now, and down the street, there's 50 of these Equinix data centers.
Oh yeah.
And there's more going up. I mean, there literally are boycotts right now because they're taking over, whole tracts of land here west of Washington, D.C. But this is going to continue to happen, where there's going to be more and more demands on the grid and the infrastructure. And the question is, how does the grid manage that at one level? And then you as a consumer, how do you protect yourself against swings? And so I think all these pieces kind of will have a confluence of saying, yeah, it makes sense for me to think about having solar and energy storage on my home to deal with not just spikes in pricing or blackouts, but frankly, the brownouts that happen that we may or may not be fully appreciating in our current status, in certain markets. Other places are already living it right now.
Sure. Yeah.
Parts of California for sure. But so I think there's, generally speaking, more of that movement. As I was hitting on before, I mean, there's this wave of legacy systems that are going to need to be supported and, changed out with newer technology. And again, just like other home services, my first home I bought, built in 1942, I had this big oil heater that took up like a whole room, and then it got replaced by like this box, after I bought it, that, basically I could put a gym in there because the space was cleared out. So I think, we have a lot of things that are lagging, and that's going to just create opportunities for upgrades. And you're going to see solar arrays that need to be upgraded. You're going to see, home systems that need to be upgraded. So in all those respects, I still feel like this is a great industry to be part of. I think we're going through a lot of growing pains, a lot of things that weren't done well. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in the general population about how all these pieces come together. And those are challenges that we face as an industry to educate our peers, our consumers to truly understand their friends and neighbors. And frankly, some of the people who are opposing what we're doing. Because I think at some level, long term, what we're saying actually does help the utilities and other stakeholders because we bring some grid normalcy. And there's going to be partnerships. I think that's also, there's got to
Hmm.
be, it can't be us, them. There's got to be ways where we see advantage. I think, VPPs offer that window into that opportunity with who owns what assets, who controls what assets. That's going to shape maybe some differences in how we all operate within the community. But one of the things I got thinking about as well, back to this, which is I've got kids who are in their teens, 20s.
Yeah.
And I think about like what their future is going to look like. And I don't mean this
Sure.
like on the environmental standpoint, but frankly, from a job standpoint,
Yeah.
where does the job pool exist
Hmm.
10, 20 years from now? And the one thing that feels like is not going away, I'd say there's, like dentists, that's not getting replaced anytime
Right.
soon. you know,
Always
uh,
need a
ele-
dentist.
right. Electricians,
Uh-huh.
carpenters, there's going to be these service trade, even, obviously dentists is getting a lot more education, but in the end, I mean, there are people who are working with their hands. There are
Yeah.
people who are having to deal one-on-one. They are not like scalable in a factory things, not yet at least,
Right.
that are going to be really critical. And so as part of this, my hope is that we'll be able to engage with like this next generation and say, hey,
Yeah.
there is an education track that's exciting, that you can have a great quality of life, and be part of this greater industry particularly on the residential side, that will span multiple products and services that these things will kind of come together around. So
Yeah.
on a little sidetrack, I mean, Green Rack, that was the first company acquired, and we had our first meeting, and they had their proverbial, Facebook, right? They had their pictures on the wall of all their
Right.
installers. I'm like, tell me about these guys. And he pointed out, he's like, oh, this guy's one of our best guys. He just started 6 months ago and he's excelled. He's like, he was in a coal mine.
Yeah.
And then he came in here and he's making twice the money, and
Yep.
obviously in much better circumstances than his parents, grandparents, etc. And this is a
Sure.
guy who was in West Virginia, Ohio borderland. And I'm like, okay, how do we find 10 more of those?
Exactly.
Right? Like, that's like, if we can tap into this type of workforce and give them a way forward in a career track that is better for them long term in so many different aspects of
Yep.
it, can't we like get people to say, all right, this is something that we should be supportive of, rather than saying it's taking away jobs? It's actually creating better jobs that are more long lasting than maybe what they were in before. So
Yeah.
there's a little bit of like, all this comes back around to creating an ecosystem in a local community,
Uh-huh.
supporting local jobs in a community by people who care about the work that they do because they're part of that community.
Yeah, yeah. And that segues perfectly. So I know you one of the things you've done is invested in building a hands-on training center. And I love that idea. What's the thinking behind that? How's it going? Tell us a little bit about that as well.
Yeah. Well, so the thinking really goes back to 2000 and 11,
Yeah.
2012, when again we were scaling so quickly at SolarCity,
Mm-hmm.
and we were bringing in 10 people like twice a week for
Yeah.
interviews to try and hire. And okay, we're hiring people, many of them had no solar experience, and actually they were more preferable because they came and we could mold them into what we needed them
Sure.
to do. They didn't bring habits maybe from hearing about it secondhand from somebody else. And so in Beltsville, Maryland, which was essentially the offshoot of the first company, the Clean Currents office,
Uh-huh.
moved to a bigger space in Beltsville. We built out a training area. It wasn't all
Yeah.
that elaborate, but it was enough to start this out, where we would teach people about safety, put their harness on, know how to tie in. How do you go and make sure that you install correctly on a roof, the L feet, the rail, whatever we were working on relative to the systems. How do you do electrical correctly? We had a wall. So these are things that many solar companies have.
Yeah.
I think the next step, though, with that experience, is we took another space in Beltsville.
Okay.
We actually built like mock houses. So now we're
Yeah.
talking 1 and 2 story roofs with like a mock basement, a mock garage, where we tried to make it experiential as much as having the space where we could try on new products and services. And so bringing a new person into that environment kind of gave you a hands-on experience specifically to what our scopes were that we needed for the products that we were installing.
Mhm.
So we had essentially a classroom and we had this. So that's really all I've kind of copied.
Yeah, yeah.
smaller scale is, we have a space that's literally down the street from the Green Rack's main office that's got space. We can bring in 20 people into a classroom environment on one side, and you go in the back and there's, 3 mock roofs. We've used it for, our employees. We've used it for some salespeople. We've actually had some governmental agency people come in and they got all excited because,
Oh yeah.
hey, I've never actually been on a roof before, and
Right.
in a safe way. So I think that tactile experience
Yeah.
has benefits beyond the person who's actually being taught how to do solar, but people who are ancillary to it, to have an appreciation for, and this is construction. There is
Yeah.
danger. There are things we need to be cognizant of, and as a salesperson to respect the limitations of what's possible, as
Yeah.
a permitting coordinator to understand why we ran something a certain way in terms of our conduit and why the electrical was placed on a wall in such a location. Frankly, even seeing the equipment,
Yeah.
I think, there are secondary individuals, certainly sales, that haven't seen the full array of how many boxes are all on a wall in somebody's basement, finished
Right.
basement, or in their garage where they're parking their car. They're getting a battery backup system, and
Sure.
they're like, wait a minute, I thought I just had this one box. No, it's like there's like 4 or 5 boxes that
Yeah.
take
Yeah.
the entire wall. So all of this is, again, just around creating an environment for education. And, even some of our vendors, have said, hey, could we use this? And I'm like, yeah, no problem. Just, throw a couple dollars into the cookie jar to help us pay the rent. But like, if this helps a third party solar company do better work, then
Yeah.
hey, that's great.
I
It helps
love
the
that.
mission.
I love that. So as we get closer to time, I'll ask a few more questions. So with your vantage point from startup founder, operator, advisor, what lessons do you think the solar industry still hasn't fully learned? And where do you see quiet innovations starting to take hold?
Lots of thoughts. I'd say, we're all grappling with how to drive to a cost-effective solution. Whatever happens with the IRA and ITC, the reality of it is we are developing systems that produce electricity that have to produce it at a rate that is comparable, lower than, utility rates.
Yeah.
Like, that's the conundrum. And also like the backup and all the other elements. And so how do you do that? And there's so many different ways that we constantly debate about, well, how do you set up sales?
Yeah.
Who can be selling for you? How do you regulate that? How do you do designs the right way? There's a lot of pieces that fall together. There isn't one right answer. Like, oh, everybody has to be local in that community 100% of the time. No, I'm
Right.
not saying that. I'm not saying that at all. I think, frankly, technology is going to drive a lot of innovation around how a system is designed, what the consumer's ability to transact in a more simplified way.
Yeah.
I mean, we have to move in these directions. It's just not quite there yet for the average consumer. I think there's a tolerance level, like in the early days of solar, where we'd go out to the system and look at it and like, I don't know if we can do that, and go back and, it took us 4 days to do an install. Now you're doing an install in 4 hours.
Yeah.
It's a very different world, but I don't know if all of those pieces are in alignment. So we do have questions about how do we best educate a consumer to want to go solar? I
Right.
think that is our biggest challenge. I think, generically speaking, when you look at solar and the cost of solar, the materials, the panels and the equipment are like a third of it, right?
Yeah.
So you've got a third roughly in that side, you got a third roughly in the labor and, some of like the direct stuff, the direct project management, and you got a third that's cost of acquisition and your profit. And that's actually probably a little bit more weighted. So it's probably more like a third, 20%. And then the rest is cost of acquisition and profit. And that's what's kind of like the part that there's got to be some movement around. We can only do so much on materials.
Sure.
Even as much as like tariffs have an impact, and they are going to have a big impact if they do go through. I mean, the price of a battery product went up substantially, because like if we don't get it in on Friday, it was going up by $2,500 to the consumer today, Monday, and I don't even know what's happened as of this afternoon with that price. So that's real money. Having kind of looking at all the cost stacks, like, that $2,000 is a subsection of those soft costs at the top. And so that's what's going to be attacked. by all of us in the industry to have a viable industry going forward. So I think innovation around streamlining steps, using technology to maybe limit some of the inefficiencies and the touch points, all those are going to be the things that are going to help us get to a future where all this stuff works. And then again, I think the partnerships that have to exist between us and utilities, like there's just no getting around it. And
Exactly.
I think that's the one that's the hard one, is to see how we can be successful and how they can be successful by partnering with us.
Yeah,
There's still a delta there.
sure.
And the reality of it is that the challenge is, like, they being in generally investor owned entities have a very different calculus of how things are going versus us. And I think we just have to figure out how we can coexist with each other. And that,
Yeah,
when that's solved, I mean, I think you'll see solar only go faster, frankly.
absolutely. Absolutely. Great points there. And I want to just kind of wrap up, close out with a little bit of reflection. So you've been on the front lines of solar for nearly 20 years, front row seat to solar's evolution. You've also been in the trenches as well. I guess when it's all said and done, like, what do you hope your legacy will be in the space?
I think in some ways I already see it,
Yeah.
which is the talented people that I got to work with along the
Yeah.
road. There are people who may be listening to this, that, not to throw their names out, but were there with me in some of the early days, and they're leaders of some of the top solar companies in the industry right now.
Yeah.
And I go back to those early stages when we're all literally sitting on a whiteboard trying to figure out how we're going to make something go. Ultimately, I think in some ways all I was a conduit to their talent,
Yeah, sure.
that they saw things in ways that I couldn't.
Yeah.
And they've propelled solar in many ways to
Mhm.
heights that I couldn't do. And so in some ways, I guess the legacy is seeing those people that maybe I was a mentor to. Now I'm trying to learn from them. And
Yeah.
it's kind of a cool dynamic. And I got a couple kids at this stage, and I'm seeing that dynamic as a parent. And it's kind of almost the fulfillment of that. So if there's
Yeah.
any legacy, I guess it'll be told through the successes of some of these folks in what they're working on today and what they work on the next step. And hopefully they do the same thing that I did, where there's some young crop that's coming in and taking it to yet another level.
Absolutely. No, I love that. It's so well said and such a cool sentiment. And I agree. I mean, we need it, right? You need to sort of mentor that next generation of leaders and have others that are doing the same. So I love that's perfect. Perfect in terms of legacy. Final question closing out, and I'll kind of open it up. So whether it's, a piece of advice you'd like to give, something you didn't get to share, something you want to part with, words of wisdom, floor is yours. I'll let you take it. Anything else you want to share with the audience?
I think we covered a lot of great topics today. The world that we're living in is so interconnected. And I think back to some of the conversations, we've got to figure out ways that we can work better, obviously with each other within the solar space, and I say the residential solar space, but understanding how these other parts of it work, the community solar, commercial, utility scale, because we're pulling from the same talent pools, the same cost of money or the same sources of money. And that's getting more and more, I guess, spread out. So I think of this like there's going to be more efficiency in how all this works by us all being better aligned and communicating, because you see wider ranges of the cost of capital, the ability to deploy. And if we're all going at this in the right way, like, we should be looking across the spectrum and saying, hey, let's do what's the best thing. And how do we drive that? And so that may be situations where it's not going to work for me in the short term, but it's going to be better for solar and better for the grid and our economic security long term. So those are hard things that are even for me to swallow.
Yeah.
But I think that's something that we all have to take a step and look at, and hopefully understanding where the other side is coming from in this vantage point. Yes, everybody's trying to protect their turf, and some, maybe the other side's a little better organized in some ways, but there are reasons for wanting them to still be in the mix. So I think, like, the all the above kind of approach is truly what we have to be thinking about. And we're not going to be successful if we try and jam one way down, the throat of politicians or consumers alike. So I think that's just a big one, just generally speaking, saying at this point, how do I see solar going forward? It's got to be in some concert as part of a bigger effort. And yeah, no, I just think like, again, in the end, this is a people business.
Yeah.
And so how do we make sure that we're supporting, our teams and developing ways for people to grow and feel like this is a career that they want to be part of? Because right now there are a number of people leaving solar because of the ups and downs and the turmoil, and they don't know where to go. And it's like, okay, there are got to be other ancillary ways to keep people engaged, whether it be, okay, you're no longer installing, you're doing O&M and service.
Yeah.
You start offering other complementary products that feed off of it, HVAC products, things of that nature. There's going to be these elements that we have to think about how to bring underneath our own umbrellas, as well as give people training so that they can participate in this energy services business.
Yeah, good stuff there. Great way to just wrap it up and conclude. Great words of wisdom there. So that brings us to the end of our conversation with Lee Keshishian, and I could do this probably for another hour, so we'll have to do it again sometime soon. He's the CEO of Civic Renewables, as we mentioned. Lee, thank you so much for bringing such a grounded, visionary perspective to this episode. It really is clear how you're helping reshape how we think about solar, both in terms of scale and how it's delivered. And to our listeners out there, if you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, share it with someone who's working in or exploring the clean energy space. And thank you for listening, and we will see you next time.
This episode of Green Giants, Titans of Renewable Energy, was brought to you by Lee Group Search. If you enjoyed today's discussion and are looking to recruit top talent for your company or find your next career opportunity in the renewable energy sector, visit LeeGroupSearch.com. Let's continue driving the future of clean energy together. Until next time, keep pushing toward a greener future.